This opening move, 1. e4, immediately claims central space, opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, and prepares for rapid development of kingside pieces. A common and principled start to many chess openings. This move mirrors white's central pawn advance, immediately contesting the d4 square and opening lines for black's queen and king's bishop, leading to classical opening structures. Developing the knight to f3 actively contests control of the center, prepares for castling, and pressures black's e5 pawn, a fundamental principle in many opening systems like the Lopez or Italian game. This move develops a knight to a central square, directly contesting white's control of d4 and preparing for further piece development. A common and solid response in many open games. This move initiates the Lopez, a classical opening that immediately challenges black's knight on c6 and aims to control the center by indirectly influencing the d4 square. This move, known as the Morphy defense, challenges white's bishop immediately, aiming to gain a tempo and potentially disrupt white's development if the bishop retreats. This move continues the Lopez, maintaining pressure on black's knight and keeping open the option of recapturing on c6 with the bishop if black decides to exchange the knight for the bishop later. This move develops the knight and attacks white's central pawn, challenging white's pawn structure and setting up potential counterplay in the center. This move, d4, decisively challenges black's central pawn and opens lines for white's pieces, aiming to seize the initiative and gain space within the Lopez, opening the game for active piece play. This move, known as the Lopez exchange variation, immediately simplifies the position and challenges white's central pawn structure. Castling kingside solidifies the king's safety and brings the rook into play, actively preparing for the middle game battle that is about to unfold. This move solidifies the pawn on e5, prepares to castle, and develops a piece, adhering to standard opening principles of development and king safety in the Lopez. This is a key move in the Lopez, aiming to prepare the advance of the d-pawn to d5, challenging black's central pawn structure and opening lines for white's pieces. Castling on the kingside is a crucial developing move, completing the king's safety and connecting the rooks for future action. This pawn push aggressively challenges black's knight and gains central space, initiating a typical Lopez pawn structure battle where white aims to exploit the potential weakness on f6 and gain a space advantage. This move, 8, Nay8, initiates a common maneuver in the Lopez, specifically the deferred exchange variation, where black aims to reposition the knight to g6 to challenge white's central control and potentially attack the kingside. This move is a common strategic choice in the Lopez, aiming to establish a strong pawn center and open lines for the rooks and queen by preparing d4. Black's capture on c3 concedes the central pawn majority to white and allows white to develop their queenside pieces rapidly, potentially leading to a queenside initiative. White recaptures the pawn with the knight, developing a piece and opening lines for the queen and rook, maintaining central pressure. This move reinforces the center and prepares to expand in the middle game, challenging white's central control and creating dynamic possibilities. This move initiates a strategic central pawn push, aiming to displace the knight and potentially open lines for white's pieces, while preparing for a potential queenside pawn advance later. This knight move, nxe5, strikes at the heart of white's pawn center and aims to disrupt their development, creating tactical possibilities and potentially freeing black's pieces. This recapture on e5 is a critical decision that resolves the tension in the center and opens the e-file for white's rook, aiming for active piece play. This move recaptures the pawn, but opening the center with opposite side castling often leads to sharp, tactical battles where pawn structure and piece activity are paramount. This aggressive recapture on e5 reclaims material and opens the e-file for white's rook, creating immediate tactical threats against black's king and central pawns. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, directly attacking the rook on e5 and forcing white to address the immediate threat. This move develops the bishop to an active square, creating a strong pin on black's knight and preparing to attack the e5 pawn. This move challenges white's advanced bishop, seeking to disrupt its influence and potentially open lines for black's own pieces. This exchange simplifies the material, leading to a more open position where white aims to exploit the slightly weakened pawn structure and active pieces. Black recaptures the rook, accepting a potentially exposed king position in exchange for material equality and opening the e-file for counterplay. This move, bxf6, is a key move in the Lopez, attacking black's queen and disrupting their pawn structure by forcing the recapture, ultimately leading to a stronger pawn center for white. This move creates a shattered kingside pawn structure, exposing your king significantly and weakening dark squares around it, requiring careful defensive maneuvers. This exchange, resulting from black's defensive sequence, simplifies the position and opens the g-file for white's rook, creating immediate attacking potential against the weakened black king. This move aims to develop the bishop to an active square where it supports the knight and prepares for potential future pawn breaks or attacks on the kingside. This move, bh5, aims to pressure the weak h7 pawn and restrict black's king's escape squares, a common theme after black's pawn capture on e5 and subsequent kingside castling. This aggressive sacrifice of the bishop for two pawns aims to disrupt white's king's safety and create tactical complications, though it comes at the cost of a significant material deficit. This move forces black to recapture the bishop, leading to a pawn structure that may offer white long-term compensation for the sacrificed material due to the exposed black king. This move initiates a critical tactical sequence, aiming to recover material by exploiting the vulnerable position of white's king and the newly acquired pawn on h2. This move recaptures the pawn on h2, forcing black to move their queen and solidifying white's central pawn majority. This move resolves the material imbalance caused by white's earlier exchange sacrifice by capturing the queen, simplifying the game and entering an endgame where black has a material advantage. The rook now occupies the d-file, aiming to create endgame pressure and exploit the open nature of the position, while black must be careful to avoid falling behind in development and material. This move reinforces the pawn chain, aiming to control the d5 square and prepare for future pawn advances on the queenside. This move solidifies the pawn chain on the queenside, preventing black from creating queenside counterplay with b5 and preparing to support white's queenside pawns in the endgame. This move activates the king, bringing it towards the center of the board to participate in the endgame play and potentially support pawn advances. The king moves to the kingside to escape the current open files and prepare for active participation in the endgame. This check forces the white king to move again, allowing black to maintain the initiative and consolidate their material advantage by bringing their rook into the game. This move initiates the king's counterplay, bringing the monarch towards the center to aid in the defense of the weakened queenside pawns and potentially join the central action. This move repositions the rook to the g-file, aiming to create immediate counterplay against the exposed white king and utilize the open file for tactical threats. 25. Rh1 transfers the rook to the crucial h file, aiming to pressure black's king and exploit the open lines created by white's pawn capture and black's king's exposed position. This move initiates a forcing sequence, aiming to disrupt white's king position and potentially win material by exploiting the open g file. The king steps into danger by moving to g3, but this is likely a desperate attempt to escape the perpetual check initiated by black's rook. This move repositions the king to a safer square, allowing it to escape the immediate pressure from white's rook and knight. This move challenges black's bishop on d6, aiming to exploit the weakness on the kingside pawn structure and potentially open lines for white's remaining pieces. This move continues the king hunt, forcing white's king to a more exposed square and maintaining initiative. The king is forced back to a more exposed central position, surrendering valuable tempo and allowing black's rook to maintain dangerous pressure along the g file. The move h5 aims to create an escape square for the king on h7, preventing potential checks along the g file and preparing to regroup the pieces for a more active defense. This move repositions the rook to the open e file, aiming to challenge black's control and potentially exploit the weakened pawn structure around black's king. This move repositions the king to a safer square on the 7th rank, preparing to support the pawns and potentially activate it further in the endgame. This move prepares to solidify white's king safety by creating a shelter, a crucial step given the compromised pawn structure in the open files. This move creates a passed pawn on the h file, which will require white to dedicate a piece to stopping it, potentially freeing up other black pieces for more active roles. This pawn capture opens the g file for your rook, creating active attacking potential against black's weakened kingside pawn structure. This move is a tactical gambit, sacrificing the rook on g4 to disrupt white's king safety and potentially force exchanges, aiming to simplify into a more favorable endgame or gain initiative. The king is now actively participating in the game, seeking safety and preparing to support the pawn majority on the kingside. With the white king exposed on g3, black's rook now controls the open h file, creating immediate mating threats and forcing white to defend passively. This rook move on the d file aims to centralize the piece, control an open file, and prepare to support potential pawn advances or exert pressure on black's weakened kingside. This rook check forces white's king to a more exposed square, potentially allowing black to mobilize their remaining pieces for an attack. This is a critical juncture where white's king, having moved to a more active central position, now needs to retreat or find safety as black's rook poses an immediate threat and the pawn structure is compromised. This move prepares to activate the rook on the queenside, aiming to exploit the open b file and potentially create passed pawns or disrupt white's king safety. This rook move activates the piece to the 2nd rank, preparing to contest the open d file and potentially create mating threats against black's king. The rook on d2 is now quite active on the open file, and black's king needs to become more centralized to participate in the defense and counterplay. This move aims to activate the bishop by repositioning it to a more central square where it can exert pressure on the queenside pawn structure and support potential pawn advances. This move aims to secure queenside space and prepare to activate the queenside pawn majority, potentially creating a passed pawn on the queenside if white is not careful. The move b-flat1 repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to support the pawn majority on the queenside and potentially prepare a queenside expansion. This move, bd5, activates the bishop and prepares to challenge white's centralized light-squared bishop on b1, aiming to free up black's queenside pawns and potentially create dynamic play. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the d5 pawn and preparing to potentially contest the a4-e8 diagonal for future activity. The rook on b5 aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and create potential weaknesses by targeting the vulnerable pawns on the queenside, forcing white to commit resources to their defense. The bishop retreats to b1 to avoid being exchanged and to maintain defensive control over the a2-8 diagonal, while also preparing to redeploy to a more active square later. With the pawn on a5 and white's bishop now on a2, black aims to solidify their queenside presence and prepare for potential pawn advances or maneuvering the king forward. This move initiates the recapture of the pawn on c6, aiming to simplify the position and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside if white can successfully advance the a-pawn. This move is a forcing check that aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially gain material if white is not careful with their king's safety. This move, 41, kc2, repositions the white king to a safer square, avoiding further checks from black's rook and preparing to consolidate the position. This rook maneuver on the third rank aims to exploit white's slightly misplaced king and potential weaknesses around the king's position, while also preparing to contest open files or create threats against the pawn structure. This move, kd1, aims to reposition the king to a safer square, away from the potential threats along the g-file and the open diagonals, while preparing to support the pawn structure. The king is actively seeking safety, but exposing itself on open files like the d-file after this move could lead to further checks and positional disadvantages. The bishop retreats to d3, defending the pawn on b1 and preparing to potentially challenge black's rooks or control the d-file. With white's king safely tucked away and black's pawns on the queenside now unified and mobile, the move b5 initiates a thematic queenside pawn expansion to gain space and potentially create a passed pawn. This move repositions the bishop to the central diagonal, aiming to create threats against black's connected queenside pawns and potentially contest the open a-file. This move initiates an attempt to create a passed pawn on the queenside, a critical strategic goal when facing a material advantage and better central control. This check forces the black king to a potentially exposed square, allowing white to centralize the rook and prepare for further king activity or a queenside pawn push. The black king ventures closer to the center, aiming to become more active in the endgame by supporting the advanced queenside pawns. This endgame features a passed pawn race, and white's king is actively participating to support its own pawn while also trying to impede black's king from reaching the queenside. The king ventures further into the center, seeking active participation in the endgame and aiming to support the advancing pawn majority on the queenside. The bishop moves to d3, reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing to contest the open file with the rook, aiming to gain central control and restrict black's pieces. This move aims to bring the rook into a more active position, potentially supporting the pawn push on the kingside or preparing for an exchange to simplify the position while maintaining some queenside counterplay. This check forces black's king into a slightly more restricted position, preparing to use white's rook to pressure the d-pawn and potentially disrupt black's pawn formation. This move forces white's king to a less secure square, preparing to utilize the open A file and potentially create a passed pawn with the B pawn on the queenside. The rook retreats to D2, repositioning to contest the open D file and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside. The king attempts to centralize by advancing into the D5 square, aiming to participate more actively in the endgame and potentially support a kingside pawn push. This move forces the black king to step into a discovered attack by the rook on the E file, highlighting the positional advantage gained by white's rook penetration. This move activates the black king, centralizing it and preparing to support the D pawn advance, while also restricting white's rook's mobility. This move aims to improve the rook's position, potentially preparing to contest the open D file or support a pawn advance on the kingside. The rook sacrifice on H1 exploits the open file and forces the white king into a less secure position, aiming to simplify into a favorable endgame or create mating threats. This move aims to regroup the king to a more central and active position, preparing to defend the weak pawn on C2 and potentially join the fight on the queenside. The rook's current position on the 5th rank, supported by the king, is strategically well placed to control key squares and potentially create threats against white's king and pawns, making this sideways move a logical regrouping to maintain pressure. This move aims to create a protected passed pawn on the queenside, a common strategy when one side has a pawn majority in that area. This move aims to consolidate the rook's position on the 5th rank, preparing to either defend the vulnerable pawn on B3 or potentially swing over to the kingside to support further attacking efforts. This king move aims to consolidate and support the pawns on the queenside, preparing for further queenside pawn advances while centralizing the king for endgame potential. This move repositions the rook to a more active square, preparing to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially create threats against the weak king if white isn't careful. This move aims to create a pawn break with B4 to challenge black's queenside majority and open lines for white's rooks, while simultaneously defending against potential checks on the C2 square. This pawn thrust forces white's king to move and allows black to create a dangerous passed pawn on the queenside. This pawn capture on B4 is a logical consequence of black's final pawn thrust, aiming to create a passed pawn, but it allows white to consolidate their pawn structure and prepare for further play. This move initiates a critical pawn break, aiming to exploit the compromised kingside and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside. The king is forced into the open but gains a vital tempo to approach the queenside pawns, which will soon be crucial for defense. The rook on D4 is now under pressure from the bishop, and this move forces a decision, potentially leading to a pawn push or a tactical exchange. White's king is centralized, but black's rook is actively placed, creating potential tactics for white to be wary of on the open files. The rook on H4 is actively participating in the defense of the pawn on B4 by supporting its advance, and preparing to potentially shift to a more active square if the situation requires it. This move repositions the rook to defend the B-pawn, a crucial defensive maneuver to prevent black from creating a passed pawn on the queenside after black's pawn push to B4. This aggressive king approach is an attempt to disrupt white's pawn structure and create an opportunity for the black rook to penetrate, aiming to exploit the open file and potentially create a passed pawn. This endgame is a pawn race, and white's king must actively participate by moving towards the queenside to support the passed pawn, rather than passively defending, with the white king returning to the center. Black's king also needs to become active to exploit the advanced passed pawn and create threats. But simply moving to d4 could be risky with the b-pawn still present. The bishop repositions to c2, maintaining its connection with the queen's pawn and preparing to support the advance of the b-pawn. After white's next pawn push, this move aims to create a passed pawn on the kingside by advancing the f-pawn, which could become a significant attacking asset if supported. This move centralizes the bishop, preparing to defend the d4 pawn and potentially support a future pawn push on the kingside while also improving the bishop's defensive posture. This move initiates the pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to create a passed pawn and disrupt white's king safety. Leveraging black's queenside pawn majority, white must solidify the king's position and prepare to defend the vulnerable pawns, as black's rook and queen remain aggressively active. This move aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside by leveraging the recent pawn exchange and the now open a-file, preparing for potential queenside expansion in the endgame. The king needs to retreat to a safer square to avoid further checks and prepare for the endgame, potentially defending the b-pawn. With the white king safely on d2, black's king must seek safety on d4 to avoid checks and set up a potential counterplay by advancing the b-pawn. This move continues white's attempt to control the center and activate their king, aiming to support the d-pawn and potentially create threats on the kingside or in the center. This pawn push leverages the discovered attack on white's king with the bishop and creates a passed pawn threat, forcing white to address immediate tactical concerns rather than consolidating their position. This move repositions the king to a more active square, aiming to support the pawns and potentially create defensive possibilities against black's advancing kingside majority. The rook move to f1 is a strategic repositioning, aiming to create a passed pawn on the f-file and to support the advance of the other pawns, potentially creating a mating attack or a decisive endgame advantage. The rook on f1 is being actively defended by the king, consolidating white's position against black's aggressive pawn push and subsequent king chase. The move 67, k5 is a crucial regrouping maneuver, aiming to centralize the king and prepare for the endgame by supporting the f-pawn's potential advance and defending against white's threats.